On behalf of the Council on Library and Information Resources and the Digital Library Federation, welcome to today's eResearch Peer Network and Mentoring Group webinar. My name is Rita Van Dynen, and I will be your moderator for today's session. As you know, the chat window is on the left of the screen. We will be pausing throughout the session for discussion, so you can post your questions or comments there. Today's webinar will conclude at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. If at any time during the webinar you experience technical difficulties, please send either Louisa or I a private chat so that we can troubleshoot with you. Just mouse over one of our names and click on the private chat option. You can also send either of us an email if you are having problems in the webinar. Also note that you can exit and re-enter the webinar at any time. Today's session is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be posted in the Clear Connect community. We do have a few clear... Hello? If you are not speaking, please mute your telephone. With us today are our postdoctoral fellows, Kendall Rourke from the University of Alberta, Natsuko Nichols from Virginia Tech, and Vesela Ensberg from UCLA. Okay, I'm going to pause right here and just ask if you are using a phone to mute your phone while you're not speaking. And if you're using a microphone, please put your microphone on mute if you're not speaking at this time. Okay, today's guest speakers are Michelle Hazlett from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and John Huck from the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Michelle will be discussing collections policy for data, and John will be speaking on collaborating to support access to data through metadata. So welcome to our guest speakers, and thank you both for agreeing to be a part of today's webinar. Just quickly, so today's webinar will be our presentations from group members, and this was for our guest speakers. Group members were asked to identify liaison and subject librarians at their institutions that provide services related to existing data and information in specific areas such as sciences, social sciences, humanities or government, GIS, and statistics. So the first 8 slides or so are our group members' the results of that activity. So after a review of these slides, we'll hear from each of our guest speakers with time for Q&A after each session. We'll close with some housekeeping items, and I just want to remind you that we do have a hashtag for our group if you'd like to tweet about today's webinar, and I encourage you to do so. Okay, let's see. Okay, so first up is Peter Rogers from Colgate University, and Peter, the floor is yours when you're...
Okay, thank you. I don't know, there's not a huge amount to say because this is an area that sort of we don't consciously think about. And that's one of the things I think we're trying to do by participating in this and some other activities is to bring some conscious thinking to something that people have just sort of done. Before I started working on this, most of this did fall into the domain of the government documents librarian, and she was the main person who considered sort of data sources. What we're trying to do now is have a central place where people can go to get data, and I don't really mention it here. I do a bit, but then also have multiple access points to this research data services page at various points in the library webpage, the library website, and also on class LMS pages. I should note one of the things that we got last year for the first time is a librarian role in our LMS system Moodle, which allows us to create a little library box on class Moodle pages where we can then put links to material, which is very important, very useful to us. Visualization and analytics, these are brand new, though our IT people are actually been working with a tool called Tableau, primarily more on the business side of things here, but we're also, with their assistance, starting to look at how that might be applied in courses and for student work. And with the collaboration and engagement, as I said, we're still working on this too. I'll often go out and sort of be the data guy at somebody else's library instruction session, particularly when we're working with seniors so they know what's available as they go through their thesis process. So that's about all I had. Thank you very much.
Up next is Northwestern. I apologize. I don't know what happened to your slide in the conversion process with Adobe Connect, so it looks a little grainy. But if you would like to go ahead, the floor is yours. I do apologize.
Sure, that's okay, as long as people can read it. Liaisons, yeah, we just hired a new GIS expert. We have had librarians, a GIS expert, and a social sciences data person in the past, and both those people left a little while ago. So those services kind of fell to the wayside a little, but we have a new person, so we're looking to build those services up and increase them. There's a really big interest in help with GIS on campus here, so the new guy has been really busy already. We do subscribe to some social sciences databases, and we also help people find them online. Again, that's mostly the social science data librarian does a lot of that. In terms of visualization, we have software on our computers, although we don't necessarily offer training on that software. Our NUIT does offer visualization services, so we often refer people to them, and I know Pam Shaw on our downtown campus has done a lot of collaboration as well. And then data collaboration or engagement, yeah, we're kind of still trying to build this up. We're giving a couple of short data sessions, data management sessions to graduate students this week because they're showing up, and we have a guide on resources, but we're hoping to definitely improve that part of our program. And that's all I got.
Montana State University is not with us today, but you can see that their slide has some formatting issues as well, but it's still legible. And they state that their liaisons offer databases that contain ICPSR, ProQuest statistical data. Those are the most frequently used. They're a contact point for data-related outreach to departments. For visualization and analytics, the Research Computing Group has traditionally helped with that, and they don't currently have any visualization projects in the library. What forms of data collection engagement do the liaison librarians use? Montana states that some liaisons discuss data research tools in their literacy training and workshops. They have a few LibGuides that address finding data, and the data management librarian is contributing a lesson to the LSCI introductory course. So that is Montana, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to the University of Arizona. University of Arizona, are you with us?
Oh,
okay,
sorry.
well,
Yeah, right.
Okay, great. Go right ahead.
Problems with finding the microphone. So we currently offer data in the areas listed on the slide: business, GIS, statistics, survey, and genome data. So we have both access to open access databases and also paid databases to our catalog, guides, and databases. And we also host a few data sets to campus. We don't offer any specialized services for manipulation and use of data and data sets, except for GIS data and software. We are in the process of hiring a metadata librarian, and that person's role will be mainly focused on providing metadata services that support U of A research and researchers. We don't have a separate collection development policy for data. We use the same criteria and funds as we use for other resources. And so I'm mainly the one that provides data management services and recommends data repositories. And we're currently bringing liaison librarians up to speed in data management and also recommending data repositories. So that's all we have.
Chris. University of Illinois, the floor is yours when you're ready.
Can you hear me? Hello? This is Heidi.
Yeah,
Can anybody hear me? Okay, great.
Yes, Heidi, go right ahead. We can hear you.
Yay. Okay, so there's a couple different things that we do here in Illinois. Some example of the subject specialist activities are we have a data purchase program, which we promote, and we solicit basically proposals for us to purchase different sorts of data sets. And either Christy and Sarah can jump in at any time to clarify anything I'm saying, but I think they've included some government kinds of data as well. And we put the limit at $5,000, and it does have to be available wider to the Illinois community, so we don't buy data sets just specifically for a given research project. But that seems to be fairly popular and something that even if people don't use it, they're really excited to hear that we have this kind of an option available for sometime in the future for them. We've had examples of subject librarians who have worked with publishers to obtain like corpora of text behind for large-scale mining projects in the humanities. Harry Green here has done that. And then we also have some examples of like kind of specific access to specific databases, like biodatabases that researchers would like access to, Rabbitopsis and biosciences. As these data is coming in from different researchers, we try to make sure to include them in the conversation whenever we're talking about their data or deposition of their data to help familiarize everybody with kind of the process and what goes into it and be inclusive. We also have built up expertise for ICPSR, and we have a representative here with that. And likewise, we've also just hired a GIS specialist to help with that. Yes?
Heidi, this is Rita. We're having a really hard time hearing you. I can hear you, but you're fading in and out. And it looks like others are as well. Are you on a speakerphone?
No, I'm not. I have a headset.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. Maybe if you want to just do, maybe move the microphone closer to your mouth and just try to do, I'm not going to ask you to start over, but just do a summary of what's on your slide, and let's just see if that helps the sound quality a little bit. And I do apologize. So let's try it again.
Right. So we have a data. Is this any better? Hello? Can you hear me any better now? It's right in front of really. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. That's a little better. Yes. If you're getting some feedback in the chat window.
Okay, I see. Right, so we have a data purchase program that we have, and we've worked with different publishers, our humanities librarian, about getting corpora of text. We have also used collection funds to obtain access to databases, and then some need-based extensions have we built up expertise with ICPSR and also hired a GIS specialist. And we always try to include the subject specialist whenever conversations about data deposit and publication come up with researchers. Examples for cultural shifts is, for a lot of librarians coming in now, we'll ask for, there'll be specific requirements about data-related duties even within their job description. We're increasingly thinking about the inclusion of data sets into collections.
Much. Thanks for going back over that one more time. It was better. I could hear you better the second time, so thank you for that. Okay, up next is University of Manitoba, and Mayu, I know that you joined us a little bit late, but let's see if your audio is working.
Hi, my name is Gary Strike, and I'm the Data Services Librarian here at the University of Manitoba Libraries. I hope you can hear me. We've had a data service.
We can, Gary.
Oh, good, thanks. We've had a data service here since about 1996, but it's always been a half-time position with the other half-time being a reference liaison. Over the years, I've covered nursing, human ecology, social work, sociology, economics, geography, and natural resources. And then about 10 years ago, we started a GIS librarian position here. That's also half-time, and the other half is liaison reference. In this case, it's for the Faculty of Environment. I would mention as well that we have a lot of contact with faculties and students outside these liaison areas. This month I presented to a medical class, and later this term I've got 3 engineering classes. Likewise, the GIS librarian has a great deal of contact with architecture, especially the city planning classes. So as the Beach Boys say, we get around. Areas we likely do not have much contact with is the hard sciences, chemistry, physics, and some humanities. In terms of discovery, the vast majority of data we deal with is now networked. Originally, most data was accessed via FTP, so it was pretty much talk to the data librarian. Now we mostly rely on subscription data sites to deliver data, ICPSR, Equinox for Canadian data, SDA CHAS for online analysis of survey data, DMTI for GIS. We also subscribe to databases such as OECD and IMF, and we link to former subscription databases now free at UN Data and World Bank. We do have a few products that are not directly networked. For these, a license must be signed, and then we write the data to a disk. Since most data is now networked, other library staff can access and show these resources. Databases are cataloged and show up in library searches, but more detailed information is usually found in library guides. However, the culture here is still largely to refer to the data and GIS librarians. Some science librarians do refer researchers directly to data such as genomic data at the National Center for Biotechnology Information. And some social science librarians do refer researchers to bibliographic data sources such as Journal Citation Reports, Web of Science, and Google Scholar. So the data and GIS librarians do not have a monopoly on the data here. In terms of visualization, we don't really have a lot of visualization resources. Staff can access a high-quality scanner. We do have a variety of GIS and spatial software in our computer labs, ArcGIS, AutoCAD, Geomatica, SPSS, and SAS, for example. As you can see from the slide, the GIS librarian is heavily involved with visualization, including generating a soil moisture index map and work with LIDAR, DEM data, etc. As a follow-up to her successes with visualization, the GIS librarian has submitted a proposal for a visualization studio, so we could be more involved in the future. In terms of consultation, I work with and help a lot of researchers. I wouldn't call that collaboration, though. It's more along the lines of providing a service. The GIS librarian, on the other hand, is collaborating with faculty and researchers in a variety of discipline areas, including soil science, environment, and geography, plus researchers from Fisheries and Oceans Canada and Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. So as always, it would be nice to do more, but my motto is that I do what I can. Thank you.
Okay, University of Rochester, the floor is yours when you're...
Okay. So similar to some of the other institutions that have presented already, we offer data through a combination of subscriptions, purchases that we host on servers or on disks here, and also facilitate the use of some publicly available data, so help people out with American Fact Finder and that kind of thing. The emphasis is sort of on business data, economic data, statistical data, political science, although we do have some databases that have chemistry data and that kind of thing. We have a newly formed Numeric, Spatial, and Research Data Services Center, which is meant to be sort of a central point for offering data management support, GIS resources, statistical software training, and that sort of thing. And so for now, that's comprised of myself, the data librarian, and our GIS research specialist. One thing that we'd like to do better on is, we have all these data resources, but they can be a little bit difficult for users to find and use. So the individual databases are cataloged, but it's not always easy for folks to find stuff within them. So we'd like to do a better job exposing what we have and what we can do. In terms of visualization, we do have a collaboratory that is about to open, I guess, which is a joint effort between the library and our High Performance Computing Center. And so we're still kind of working out the details of exactly how our liaison librarians are going to be involved with that, but it is something that we'll be working with going forward. For engagement around data support, I think I and the GIS research specialists are sort of the primary point people for this. But we've been doing a lot of thinking within our institution about the various roles that librarians take on, and part of that is data services. So we're doing a lot of figuring out, exactly what subject liaison's role in data should be and how it should look different for people in different areas with different interests and skills and that kind of thing. So that's kind of where we are.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Okay, University of Toronto.
So that's me, and I'm on a
whenever you're ready.
speakerphone. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep. Oh, darn. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
All right, so for access to data, we subscribe to a number of different kinds of data. We've got GIS.
Go right ahead.
Pardon me? Are you okay? Yep, all right. So we've got access to a bunch of different kinds of data, GIS and statistical and poll data, quantitative data across many disciplines in the social sciences and sciences. It's a combination of subscription and open access sources, and again, a combination of pointing to data that's on vendor-hosted platforms and locally hosting a series of microdata and aggregate statistics and GIS data. So it's really a mixed bag. Some access to our data is provided through our main catalog, but there's extensive access through the data library website, and so I think that's one of the places where we could deepen the access to the data by providing more points of access. We do have a central collection development formal committee that's been struck for centrally assigning funds for purchasing data resources. That's relatively new, and they're just working on the policy around that committee now. For visualization and analytics, our map library provides GIS-oriented visualization, and our GIS librarian is actually quite active in teaching in that area. And our data library also provides assistance using stat packages like R and SAS and SPSS and Stata. And the data librarians recently done some collaborations around data visualization with a health sciences group that was presenting the results of a health survey. And our web development group also offers some assistance with mapping and timeline type data visualizations. But this is an area that we all really are interested in expanding. We're very, very interested in how visualization might be used to support conducting research rather than presenting research. As far as data collaboration points go, our subject liaisons do recommend suitable data sources and disciplinary repositories for hosting research data. And if I check across all of our LibGuides, is quite standardly a mention of suitable subject-oriented data repositories in each of the subject LibGuides.
And there's also a couple of specific LibGuides for GIS and data sources. And there's some reference data support. So there's sort of the primary triage might happen at a reference desk with reference back to the data and GIS and management data librarians and science research data librarians where more in-depth help is needed. But I think this is an area where all of our liaisons are very interested in building their capacity and comfort level to provide support for data, because we just see that as an area that's expanding. And that's it from Toronto.
Okay, so we're going to pause here for just a minute for questions or comments from group members to one another. Also, our guest speakers, if you have any questions for any of the group members with regards to what they've presented, feel free to type those in the chat window. So we'll just pause here for a minute. From Rochester, it looks like is asking Heidi, I'm sorry. Heidi, you mentioned that your data purchase program is popular. Could you say more about how it works?
Can you hear me? Yes, okay, good. So we solicit proposals basically through a campus-wide email, and we have little cards that we give out at different faculty events like open houses and things like that. And the way it works is that there's a basic minimum, our basic max cap at $5,000, and there's certain guidelines that go along with it, in that we have to be able to make the data set available to the rest of the Illinois community. It can't be just specifically for one given research group. And by popular, I meant too that even when we've been at open houses or something like that, and we tell people about the program, even if they didn't have a really a data set in mind at the time, they're really interested in to hear about it, and it's really good for people to think of, oh, I should go to the library for things other than my journals or my books or things like that.
So we'll keep using the chat window to converse about these issues, and we will move along in just a minute. And Peter, did you have a question? Peter wants to know how many folks regularly put data sources in their catalogs. And if any of you want to respond to Peter, it looks like Toronto is formalizing a way to get data purchases in their catalog. Okay, we'll give it just another minute here. While you all are typing away, I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce our first guest speaker, Michelle Hazlett. Michelle is the librarian for Numeric Data Services and Data Management in Davis Library at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Previously, she was the librarian for Data Services and Government Information at the North Carolina State University Libraries from 2005 to 2008, and the demographics specialist at the State Library of North Carolina from 2000 until 2005. Working with and acquiring data sets has been the main focus of her work throughout her career. She has earned her MSLS in 1999 from UNC at Chapel Hill. She graduated with a BA in Honors in 1990 from Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. So welcome, Michelle, and thank you for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Rita. I'm going to start by giving you all just a little bit of background about data services at Chapel Hill. Our program here is pretty long-standing. We've had a person essentially doing data services for 15 or 20 years, and it's evolved over time. It started in the government information section, and we added a GIS librarian about 10 or 11 years ago. We added a second GIS librarian about 6 years ago, and we've just had sort of a earthquake of change here in the last 6 months. In March of this year, we formed a digital research services department and pulled in both GIS librarians and myself as the data librarian, plus a person who does digital exhibits with Omeka, and a digital scholarship person that we hired about a year and a half ago. We also have people who collaborate with the program. So there's somebody from our technical services department who just is interested in statistics and has learned an awful lot, and he's not on a reference desk, or he's not public service, but he's able to make appointments with people to consult about getting data into analyzable format. So if they need to just clean up their data or get it from one format into another or that kind of thing, he's available for that kind of help. In terms of databases, we have an awful lot of them. We have tons of subscription databases. The opportunities for subscription databases have really exploded in the last few years. So we're an ICPSR member and a ROPR member, but we have all kinds of other things like DataZoa and cross-national time series data and country data from PRS Group. We have just a couple of the ProQuest databases, Statistical Abstract. We have Statista, so on and on in that regard. Other services that we're offering through the Research Hub, the Research Hub is sort of the new space that's dedicated to digital research services. And we're offering all kinds of workshops in that space in terms of data visualization, GIS data. We'll have a workshop on geocoding historical maps this fall. We have census workshops. We have lots of the ICPSR webinars that we're streaming in that space. So workshops, 3D printing. Our Keenan Science Library has a hub that has 3D printing and scanning. Our institutional repository takes data sets, so kind of depending on how large they are and how complicated they are, we may or may not be able to handle some of those. We help people obtain text mining rights from publishers, and we, of course, purchase data that are just monographic data sets, like the Latin American public opinion polls. We also collaborate a lot. We have buying arrangements with Duke University for the LaPop data to jointly archive all of those data sets. And with the Research Hub, we're now working really closely with the Odum Institute. They're sort of a tenant in our building, but now we're sharing lab space as well as responsibility for promoting ICPSR and things like that. So data services, the way my position has been defined, has been around for about 8 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. Promotion has been primarily by word of mouth. With the change to the Research Hub, we're getting into more active promotion, but I'll try to address that later. I should say I'm going to whiz through these slides because it's just there's more content than 20 minutes really allows, but hopefully there will be time at the end for some questions. So we handle requests from our patrons at the rate of about 2 to 5 per year, and they're all over the map. They have all kinds of subject requirements and format requirements, and I'll give you some more information about that in just a moment. What we have on our website is really brief. This is the total web page that presents our purchase policy at the moment. We are considering a more complicated one, but this has been sufficient for quite some time. Basically, we wanted to just give people an idea of the kinds of considerations that we keep in mind when we're buying data. Of course, price, how many researchers are likely to use the product, and then just whether or not we've spent our money for the year, or sometimes we get money at the end of the year to buy something extra that's a large pot of money, and sometimes we're able to do special things with that. So for the most part, we've taken a pretty informal approach to our policy. We buy in a very collaborative way at UNC, and so if somebody becomes aware of a data product that they want for their particular department, generally they'll get in touch with me and we'll discuss, who might else be interested. So this has worked really well for us for a long time. We used to have a separate budget for data that was about $2,500, so not very large, and it's difficult to do much with that amount of money these days. Most of the databases that are out there are being sold on a subscription basis and not as monographs, and it's difficult to find relatively inexpensive data sets that are available for outright leasing, I'll say, rather than purchase, because for the most part they do limit how they can be used. So in about 2010, we changed from a very centralized bibliographic method of selecting materials to a very decentralized system. And instead of having just 3 bibliographers for the entire library, that's not entirely true. 3 main bibliographers for the social sciences and humanities, I'll say. We sort of exploded that out to 20 or 30 bibliographers so that each person would have fewer subjects they were responsible for, and hopefully more time to meet with the faculty in those departments and develop closer relationships with them. The way things are for us as data librarians in this system isn't all that different from how we worked before. We buy most of our materials through the social sciences subject team, and those are the people that we've always collaborated with most closely. But if there's a data set that's in the sciences that they know the business folks are also going to be interested in, we would make that a collaborative purchase, and each team would contribute money to that. Most of our subscription databases are funded centrally, so that money is not in our budget at all, which is a good thing because those databases are really expensive. But I would guess that we spend, it varies a lot. Last year we bought a data set for several faculty in different departments that were doing different kinds of research, but all needed access to online job ads. And we bought access to some of that data for $5,000 for a 1-year span of access. So last year we probably spent at least $10,000 on data, but there are a lot of variations in that depending on what data people are asking for. So as you're getting the idea, our acquisitions are strongly driven by what our patrons want. Our patrons find out the most obscure data sets I have ever encountered. There are lots of these that I have never heard of before. So we really rely on what they're asking for as a main driver of what we buy, but we do have to weigh, how much they cost and how many people will use them and that kind of thing. They are across subjects, economics, political science. We have a historical business data set that the business school purchased and essentially got paid enough to give access to the entire university. Realty data has been popular in the last couple of years with the home mortgage crash. We've helped people get military personnel counts by Freedom of Information Act request and paid the cost for that request. Because it's public data, then we're able to give access to anybody who wants it once we've purchased it. Usually it's very cheap. We have done several of these requests, have only had to pay cost at all for one of them, and that was only processing costs of how much time it took them to prepare the data to be released. We buy lots of formats. In numeric data, we would buy Stata, SPSS, SAS, R, any of those, plus we get all kinds of comma and tab delimited data that can go into any kind of format and is used in GIS analyses as well as numeric, like quantitative kinds of analysis programs. We have gotten lots on CDs and DVDs. Publishers are beginning to sort of abandon those in favor of external hard drives these days, but the media that they come on is also an issue that we have to deal with. I'll go back to that. In terms of the media that we buy things on, we try to give as much access as possible by loading things on library servers so that our users can download from wherever they are. Publishers don't always allow that. We have to negotiate special permission to do that. But so far, people have been pretty flexible in giving us that permission, and it works out really well for our patrons. So we put up the brief policy because we kept answering that same question over and over again. Can you help me buy something? Sort of what are the criteria for purchasing a data set? So it was helpful to explain those basic limitations. Then we bought a data set from a British publisher that was intraday bond trading data. So intraday bond trading is what happens essentially every second. So I can't remember what the exact size of the final data set was, but it was something over 150 gigabytes. And they had us download all of this data. Well, fortunately, the student who wanted it was highly motivated, and she stuck with the downloads through a lot of technical difficulties and was finally able to get everything that she needed after some amount of back and forthing with the publisher. But then we had 150 gigabytes of data. We couldn't keep that on our servers, so we have broken down and just kept it on an external hard drive that we happen to have extra room on from another data set. But now if anybody wants to use those data, they have to get the external hard drive, transfer the files to their own hard drive because we can't give them our hard drive. So it became this big thing. And we started thinking about, we need to kind of cut this off at the knees. We don't want to have this kind of problem in the future. And so we thought about creating a policy that would have greater depth to it and would address more of these issues that we can kind of see coming down the pike. And when we started looking around at other policies for other institutions, we found that there's actually a lot of other possibilities for inclusion in the policy. So I've included a lot of slides at the end that deal with the more detailed content of our policy. I'm not going to go over those in great detail, but the slides will be available to you in the recording after the session on the CLEAR website. And if you want a copy of these, my email address is on my second slide. You can email me and I'll be happy to send you the slides. So we started by deciding for ourselves that we wanted a more formal policy. So it was initiated by the selection librarians, and we basically just went and looked at other institutions' policies. There's a bibliography at the very end of my slides. Haley Mooney is a data librarian at Michigan State University, and she did quite a search of U.S., I think mainly U.S., institutions for data collection policies. And so all of the credit for that bibliography goes to her. I really used her list in initiating our research into policies. And basically we picked and choose the pieces out of those policies that seemed important for us. So when you get down to it, the policy that you create is really specific to your needs. And it's really interesting to read other people's policies because you think, gee, I wonder why that's in there. I wonder what circumstance made them include that. But you get a lot of good ideas from looking at what other people have considered. We also found other advantages in this process. A lot of it was planning ahead, thinking ahead. What are we going to do when we have more demand on our budget and we're not able to just buy whatever people ask for? Not that we can buy whatever they ask for now, but we expect that to be an ongoing and increasing problem. So I'm interested to hear about the person who has a $5,000 limit on the purchases that they will make for any particular request. That might be something that we would think about later on. We have, I don't know that we really needed to do this internally, but we expect to make our policy public eventually once we've completed it. So it's not actually available at this point, but when we do make it available to the public, they'll be able to see how much we collaborate across the university and with other institutions. That's just a normal part of what we do, a useful way that we have found to work, but it's really nice for our users to understand those relationships. We have a really strong value at UNC of serving the public, even more than our land-grant university in the state. And in terms of how we serve the public, it's really important for us to show people what those relationships are. We're very lucky also to have a particular donor associated with the library who likes in particular to support graduate research. And so if there's something that someone needs to complete their master's degree or dissertation, a particular book that needs to be purchased or a data set, we've often been able to get that money from this particular donor, so that we have been able to buy some things that are very expensive for just one person. And sometimes that's led to, oh, you know, we bought something on that fund last year. This other patron can use that too. And it turns out not to be just one person who's going to use it. It turns out to be useful for multiple people. We also found it useful to formalize the weeding policy. We are not a repository for data, and so we do weed our data sets when they seem to become less useful and less used. We only have so much space on our servers to be able to serve up the most current data to our users. And so currency is not the only criteria, but in terms of what people actually seem to be using, we will take stuff down. And so we don't accept gifts. Typically, I shouldn't say that. We accept gifts. We just won't keep them forever. So if somebody wants in particular to deposit data that, for instance, is going to be associated with an article, we would encourage them to talk to our institutional repository, the Carolina Digital Repository, to deposit the data there rather than asking us to keep it. So data services, our data services unit, which was a section within the Research and Instructional Services Department, moved to this new department, Digital Research Services, in March. And we're expecting this to raise our profile across campus. The GIS librarians are so busy at this point that they will only meet with people in half-hour appointments, 2 hours a day, every weekday. People have to schedule their appointments online, and they need the rest of their day to work on questions that they've gotten, to do committee work, to do planning work for the Research Hub, and various other things. So they have had to limit their consultations that severely in order to get all their work done. They really don't need a lot of promotion. Our next step for them is probably to hire a third GIS librarian. And they're getting a lot of demand from the Geography Department and from the City and Regional Planning Department, sort of as their historically demanding areas. But more and more people are getting interested in visualizing data with GIS. And so they're beginning to get users from across the social sciences and the sciences. We get lots of public health users who are trying to use GIS. So they're very much in demand. As the data services librarian, even though I've been around, I mean, not that I personally have been around, but my position has been around longer than the GIS ones have, people don't know about me as much as they do. I'm not in as much demand as the GIS librarians are. And I'm finding already, even with our Research Hub only having opened in late August, that my questions are increasing. And staff members are beginning to refer more questions to me already. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that goes. We've been in a declining budget situation for years and years. We haven't had raises in like 7 years, and our collections budget has been cut by 3 to 5% every year the last 5 years. So it's not like we're devoting a whole lot of new money to this effort, but our strategic plan, our 5-year strategic plan, discovered that there was a lot more emphasis among faculty on expecting the library to help with data. And so the Research Hub is a way to meet that demand and we're just devoting people to it as we're able to. Some of our folks in the new department came from a sort of old department that dissolved. Its leader left us for another university, and the whole department kind of got disbanded. It was assigned to other departments across the library. So that was a digital projects department called the Carolina Digital Library and Archives. And essentially we were trying to move from a digital projects kind of approach to a digital programs kind of approach to better manage the kinds of requests that we were getting and how much in the way of library resources was being devoted to those. So I'll just run really quickly through these next few slides. This is the table of contents from our more formal policy that we're still in the process of discussing. Purpose and scope, current and future trends, collection strengths, responsibility. Responsibility really, sort of the main responsibility for data resides with the GIS and data librarians, but we definitely involve subject librarians as appropriate for whatever the particular data set is. We have a lot of relationships within the university and with other institutions. In that next chapter, there may be a few pages long, as you can see. Selection criteria, I'm going to go into a bit more detail in a moment. Data formats and access types. I pretty much already talked about this, the media that the data come on. We're really trying to get away from the CDs and DVDs at this point and arrange digital access more consistently as we can. Weeding I talked about, and then other possibilities I also list in these slides. So here are the selection criteria. File size became a big one after the intraday bond trading data. I'm not sure that we really need a language section. People were, it seemed like a lot of policies listed that, and so it's in there for discussion, but I'm not sure that we'll end up including that in the end. For the most part at UNC, English is the primary language, and there's only a few subjects where emphasis on a foreign language is really more important than English. But, you know, that wouldn't limit us in terms of what we would buy. If the French department needed a particular French data set, we would buy that. Licensing and accessibility, I think it's useful to address this in the policy if your users actually read it. But the thing about licensing is that your users really need it at the point of use. And so we have really endeavored to put that information into the download page where people go to actually get the data. I can't say that we have real tests of how effective that is, but we have definitely tried to highlight it there. And then subject scope is all over the map for us. And user status, we would probably give priority to faculty over graduate students over undergraduates. But we have quite a few undergraduates, for instance, in the economics honors classes who are doing what I would consider to be at least graduate level research, and often I don't see faculty members doing this kind of research. So it really depends on how serious the user is as much as anything. I will try to answer some of these questions in the chat. So Sarah at Illinois, when the library makes data sets available for patrons to download from a library server, do you share it with or present to patrons the terms or limitations of the license that was negotiated when the data set was purchased? Yes, we do. In the beginning, that was kind of inconsistent, and now we're making that much more consistent. And along with that, the business about putting data set in the catalog, we used to have separate from the catalog a GIS data finder and a separate statistical data finder. And these were curated links where subject librarians had said these were important websites for people to know about for these areas. There's obviously lots of GIS data available freely online, but they were all silos. And so lots of users didn't know about them, and they weren't particularly easy to use. So we've really tried to do away with those silos and put everything in the catalog. It does take a lot of work. We have a monthly meeting between the data librarians and our catalogers to work on it. You know, catalogers aren't likely to have SPSS on their machines. They certainly don't have ArcGIS on their machines. And so even if they did have them, they wouldn't have the experience on a regular basis to know what they were looking at. And so we really have to work together to get that information where users can really use it, discover it.
Michelle, this is Rita. I do apologize for interrupting. We are going to have to have you answer the questions in the chat window or by private chat so that we can make sure we have enough time for our next guest speaker. So I'm not sure how many slides you have left that you want to touch on.
I'll spin through these really quickly just so you can see what's there. These are other areas that were mentioned in some of the policies that we might think about. These aren't a priority for our policy, but just different things that might be considered. And then particular statements. Some people felt it important to put particular statements about licensing in their policies. Again, I think it's more important to have that information at the download point. So there you are. And then this is the bibliography slide of Haley's links that she provided. She also gathered a bunch of citations for articles that were written about data collection policies. And if people want that, please email me. I'm happy to send that out. In terms of the weeding policy, most of the time we have licensed data, and so we're not able to archive it. We have to destroy it. If it's on a permanent kind of media like a CD, we might stick it in our offsite storage facility, but other than that, we're not keeping those data. Yes, we do include data online for our reading policy. We don't have a specific cutoff date. We base it more on what people are finding useful and what people are actually using. So our download stats are most important in that. So that's all the questions that I see there for me. So I'll pass it back to Rita.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Michelle. You can continue to answer questions in the chat window. Attendees, you can also send Michelle a private chat. We do need to move on to the next guest speaker. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kendall, who's going to do a brief introduction for John.
Thanks, Rita. So John Heck is a metadata and cataloging librarian at the University of Alberta Libraries in Edmonton. In addition to his primary duties planning for and creating metadata for the library's digital collections, he also performs traditional cataloging duties for maps and music. Through his participation in the Canadian Polar Data Network, he helped create metadata for research data from the International Polar Year. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to John. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kendall. Can everyone hear me? Hello? Yes, okay, good. I'm reminding myself to look at the chat window on the left-hand side as well. Okay, thanks very much for the invitation to speak today to you, and I'm going to be talking today about a collaborative data curation project that I was involved with through the University of Alberta Libraries' participation in the Canadian Polar Data Network. So the network was originally called the Canadian IPY Data Assembly Center Network, and it originated as a part of a large international event called the International Polar Year. So today I'm just going to focus on one part of the network's activity, namely our metadata implementation, which is what I was involved with. And so I will be describing the processes that we undertook to develop a set of metadata guidelines. To set the stage, I'm first going to talk about the International Polar Year and the Data Assembly Center Network and how it came to be. Then I'll give a brief description, overview of metadata in the polar research community, just to give a bit of context. And then I will come to describe the metadata working group's deliberations and its outputs. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the technical details of the guidelines, which you're free to look at. And in fact, what I'm going to do is just copy the link to the Polar Data Network website into the chat box here, so that you can go and look at it, and also the link to the slides. Just grab this and put it in. Okay, so that's the guidelines there if anyone wants to look at them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the technical details, but instead I'm going to focus on the collaborative aspect of the project, which I think is probably of interest to the group today. As it happens, collaboration was a feature of the International Polar Year on many levels, which I think you'll probably see. Of course, collaboration is nothing new for librarians, and just from my limited experience, I think that it's definitely going to be one of the dominant modes by which data curation continues to develop, working with different partners. And before I go any further, I'd just like to say hello to Mayu Ishida, who was at the University of Alberta and working on this project while we were engaged in it. So it's good to see you participating in this group, and I'll have to send you an email later, I suppose. Okay. So a little bit about the International Polar Year. It was a large scientific program focused on the Arctic and the Antarctic, which ran from 2007 to 2009. It was organized through the International Council for Science and the World Meteorological Organization, and it involved over 200 projects with thousands of scientists from over 60 nations examining a wide range of physical, biological, and social research topics. So it was highly interdisciplinary. Researchers were also required to work with Inuit and other northern communities to ensure traditional knowledge was integrated with scientific knowledge. This was not the first International Polar Year. There have been others. The last one was held about 50 years ago. This Polar Year had a strong emphasis on, okay, I'm saying, can I speak a little louder? I'll speak a little bit louder. I'm on the handset on the phone, so I can't get it any closer, but I'll try to speak up a bit. Hello? Okay, let me know if it's better or if it's still not good. Okay. So this Polar Year had a strong emphasis on data access and preservation because of the recognition that data collected during the Polar Year could only serve as a benchmark if it survived until the next Polar Year. So a very strong data policy was adopted on the international level. So the international body coordinated the national programs of each country that participated in IPY. Canada's IPY program was operated from the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. It provided $150 million over 6 years to researchers, and it funded 52 science projects across the country. It adopted a data policy that was essentially the same as the IPY data policy, and so it required that data generated by every IPY project be made fully, freely, and openly available to all interested users within the shortest possible timescale, with some exceptions. Also, that data must be deposited in data centers and repositories for long-term preservation. So since Canadian researchers would be required to deposit data in repositories, the Canadian Program Office needed to ensure that infrastructure was available for this purpose. And so it invited institutions across the country to participate in a data assembly center network that would collectively operate a data repository and offer services to the researchers with provisions for long-term preservation of the data. So 6 organizations were selected to participate in this, and hailing from various corners of the academy and government. So it was a very cross-sectoral group, you could say, and they are listed in the slide here. So the Polar Data Catalog, which was already operating a catalog and a repository for polar data at the University of Waterloo, in the Geography Department, I believe, University of Alberta Libraries, Scholars Portal, which is a service of the Ontario Council of University Libraries, as well as a number of federal government departments here in Canada. So Fisheries and Oceans, Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and SISTI, which is part of the National Research Council. So once the network had been formed, our work was actually, we needed to work on a very short timeline. And so in quick order, a metadata working group was established to select a metadata standard for the network and develop implementation guidelines. So the network, the people participating in the network, it was not a large group of people. Most of the network partners only had 1 or 2 people participating in all aspects of this collaboration, and so there were no more than half a dozen of us in the metadata group. We faced a number of challenges right off the bat, I would say. Even in such a small group, we came from a mix of backgrounds. There was metadata librarians, systems librarian, GIS specialists, geographers, and federal bureaucrats. So we each had a varying level of familiarity with the research domains, which ranged all the way from health science to climatology and everything in between. We were working in a very short time frame, as I mentioned, while also being geographically dispersed. We were scrambling to familiarize ourselves with complex metadata standards, and we had to complete the task even while a number of important system-level decisions for the network were still up in the air. So I would like to take a short detour now and just review, for context, some of the metadata standards that are used in the polar research domain. What you'll notice is that most of these are geospatial metadata standards. This is more than likely because the core constituencies within the community, such as Earth and atmospheric science and oceanography, already deal in spatialized data. And so they are already using these standards, and the repositories that exist in the area have been implemented with those standards. So just going through them, you can see that they're roughly in chronological order. One of the oldest ones is directory interchange format, which was developed beginning in 1987 and became adopted as the preferred format for NASA's Global Change Master Directory. And it was developed to achieve catalog interoperability for a wide range of materials, and one of its significant features is a vocabulary of science keywords. Next, the content standard for digital geospatial metadata, which will no doubt be familiar to many people who work with GIS, also called FGDC, the name of the body that it originates from, probably because FGDC is easier to say as an acronym. And this was the culmination of efforts beginning in the 1980s to create a standard for GIS and digital cartography, and it also led to the creation of the FGDC itself. So it was enacted by presidential executive order in 1994 and was widely implemented in U.S. federal departments. A revision appeared in 1998. The ISO 19115-2003 is structurally very similar to the FGDC standard, and that's because it attempted to codify international practice. And so FGDC was one of the main main standards that it was attempting to assimilate. And so, as I say, structurally, it's very similar to the FGDC, but there's more widespread adoption of it, although the momentum for its adoption worldwide remains somewhat slow, I would say, but it's generally acknowledged as the standard that people are moving towards. So when FGDC itself endorsed the ISO in 2010, it essentially precluded further development of the FGDC standard. Finally, the North American profile of the ISO standard is almost identical to the ISO standard itself, and basically what it does is it takes the mechanisms that the ISO specifies to extend the standard while still being valid within the standard. So it adds a couple of extra elements, not too many, some additional code values, and it probably most importantly for the Canadian context, it provides a mechanism for bilingual records, which is a requirement of the federal government. So just to give you a break from the text, here are some pictures of screenshots from the websites of the various standards that I just outlined. Of course, they all have lots of information on them. The North American standard, the NAP standard, is actually maintained by two standards bodies, one American and one Canadian, jointly. This slide just gives you an idea of the adoption of these standards, and you can see it's not homogeneous. Around the world, different data centers are using different standards, but generally speaking, the older that the data center is, the more likely it is that it'll be using one of the older standards. The Polar Data Catalog, one of our partners, its infrastructure was built to support the FGDC standard, and here on a screen capture from the site, you can see that the search interface leverages bounding box coordinates that are found in the metadata and allow you to do a search by drawing a box around a geographical area and returning results that fall within that. Okay, so returning now to our metadata working group, I already mentioned some of the challenges that the group faced when it formed, and when it came to choosing the standards that we were going to use, the standards, we became aware of certain constraints that were inherent in the collaboration as well. So the Polar Data Catalog, as I mentioned, which was in the end to be the front end of the repository and basically the active part, was built around FGDC. At the same time, some of the government departments, DFO and NRCan, would be required to use the North American profile just by government policy. NRCan had already developed NAP guidelines for its use. International practice varied, but it was trending towards ISO adoption. So what did we decide? Well, we knew we had to work with the infrastructure that was built and that currently existed because the time frame was short, but the network committed to producing NAP records because of the compliance requirements of our partners as well. The two standards are similar, they can be crosswalked, but it did mean that we had to be cognizant of the requirements of both standards to make sure that we were covering off everything. So we were we wanted to make sure that we could operate now, but also produce NAP records in the future. So once we had made decisions about which metadata standards we were going to use, we set about drafting the implementation guidelines for them. Our main concerns were that we made sure we would be able to produce valid NAP records, and also that we had a common understanding and interpretation of the elements that we were going to use just amongst the network partners. And this is because the network partners were each going to play a role in contacting researchers, working with them to get the data into the repository, and creating at least some of the metadata that would, or some aspects of the metadata that would go with the data. So our working method was to first identify all the mandatory elements within the NAP standard. Then we mapped the current PDC elements to the mandatory NAP elements, and we added any NAP elements that weren't mandatory but that the PDC was using an equivalent of. And this then allowed us to identify a small number of instances where a mandatory NAP element did not have a corresponding element in the PDC metadata, the polar data catalog. And so with this information, then a small number of modifications were made to the PDC metadata entry form and database so that we could accommodate the extra information required for the NAP records. Once we had done that, then the working group worked its way through the set of elements, the spreadsheet that we had, identifying places where we needed to make decisions around interpretation of the meaning of the elements, implementation, or specifying best practices. So just to give you an idea of the types of things that we were looking at on the next couple of slides, date types. For instance, you could specify a number of types of dates, so date of creation, publication, revision, but how exactly would you define the date of creation, especially for data sets that are time series that have been that may have been collected over a long period of time. Responsible parties, where there was a very large number of people on the research team, what kind of guidance did we want to give to say how many people should be included as responsible parties in the metadata? What kinds of roles should they be assigned in the metadata as well? We talked about digital object identifiers, which we knew we wanted to implement, so we needed to make sure that was in the metadata. We also talked about access constraints. What options would we give people for specifying embargo periods or not? What information did we want them to capture in the purpose and abstract? So we wanted to make sure, for instance, that methods and names of variables, important ones, were captured in the purpose and abstracts that were created in which is a pair of common elements that appear in GIS metadata. Also capturing relationships to other research projects, how would we do that? And in the end, we took advantage of NAP's ability to create hierarchical records in order to make links between data sets that came from the same research projects. So I mentioned that our timeline was pretty short, and this just gives you an idea. The work really got underway at the end of 2010, and the intensive work the metadata working group undertook was undertaken basically in the first half of 2011. We had a few meetings in person, and then otherwise we worked by email and also using a wiki. The major decisions were finished by the end of June, I would say, of 2011, and it took a little while to complete the formal document that I shared the link to earlier. So I'm going to talk now just to mention a couple of methods that we use to come up with our decisions, working methods. So this is a picture of the spreadsheet that we came up with for basically systematically going through the set of metadata elements and identifying mandatory elements and so forth. One challenge that we faced was that the NAP standard is very difficult to work with because it has a highly nested structure, and also because it reuses modular sets of elements called components. And so it's not just simply a case of putting down, say the 10 elements and answering them, because you had to kind of keep plugging in components that were nested within components within components. So representing this in a structure in a spreadsheet required a bit of ingenuity, and we used some color coding of the fields to try to indicate this, which made for a rather colorful working document, which I guess was at least pleasant to look at. And then, as I think I mentioned, we used a wiki to track decisions. So right out off the bat, we knew that there was a certain set of decisions that were going to have priority because they might have an impact on the Polar data catalog. They would lead to modifications of their database, and so the top of this slide here shows basically one decision that we needed to make. So it specifies the clause of the metadata standard, the name of the element, what the issue is, some comments, and then options that we considered. And over on the right-hand side, under the vote column, you can see initials that recorded how we all voted. In this case, it looks like we chose option 1. But this was a useful method for us because it allowed us to vote asynchronously, and also it made sure that everyone was going to have input in the decisions, but it was also very specific, and so it made it easy to translate it into the guidelines document. The bottom of the screen shows just a section of one of the tables from the guidelines document. I guess the same element, what wound up there. The next slide also shows, just in case you haven't looked at the guidelines document, this is a page from the guidelines, a table that shows the elements, and by this point I'd come up with a simpler way to represent the nested structure, so it wasn't quite so bad to look at. I've shared the links before, but here they are again. At the end of the IPY project, the network partners decided that they had gained enough experience working together. As I mentioned, we were from different sectors, and so working methods and even funding cycles and so on were often out of sync with each other. But we had built basically relationships amongst all the network partners, and we wanted to build on that. And so the network renamed itself as the Canadian Polar Data Network, and has been positioning itself to support similar types of research endeavors similar to the IPY. So with the exception of Natural Resources Canada, the original partners are all still part of the network. So just a little bit more, and I think this is almost my last slide, so I'll wrap it up pretty quickly here. Just a few observations about my project. As metadata librarian, as a metadata librarian, of course, we often dream of the ideal and perfect metadata, but this hardly ever exists in the real world. So instead, you often need to work within the limitations of present tools and systems while anticipating future opportunities. And I think this project was a real lesson in that for us. Following standards as much as possible and resisting the temptation to deviate for local needs. For one thing, it makes your metadata machine actionable, which just extends its reach and the possibilities of what you can do with it, but it also makes it easier to take advantage of those future opportunities. Didn't talk about this in much, but it was important also for us to create a workflow, to map out the workflow, to understand who's going to be creating which parts of which metadata, so that we weren't just speaking about metadata in a vacuum. Finally, I think that I came to appreciate the role of communities in originating and sustaining practices and standards, in this case for metadata. Standards don't generally get too far without a community that's actively using them, and the best ones, I think, express and refine community practice at the same time. So participating in and collaborating with communities is important for understanding the logic and functions of their standards, and through those standards, the practices and their needs. So that's what I have today, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
John. John has also included some reference slides, and of course those will be available in the recording. So if you have questions for John, go ahead and post them in the chat window, and John, while I'm wrapping up today's session, you can respond there in the chat box. And again, thank you both, Michelle and John, for joining us today. For our group members, just a few housekeeping items. Our next webinar is scheduled for the 16th of October, and we'll focus on services evaluation, planning and conducting evaluations of your own efforts. A quick mention of consultations. Your consultation questions have been received, and our postdoctoral fellows and faculty are working on those, consolidating them into one manageable topic, and they will be contacting you about what they've done and talking with you about moving forward with those consultations. Again, the in-person event for our group is Sunday, October 26th. And if you are sticking around for the DLF forum the next day, the 27th, there are some group members, Mayu Ishida, Chris Collin, Sarah Williams, and Kathleen Fear, along with our postdoctoral fellows Ina Cooper and Kendall Rourke, are doing a panel on Monday the 27th at 1:30, and it's called Building a Community of Practice for Research Data Services. Experience of clear DLF e-research, peer networking, and mentoring groups. So I look forward to that panel. And again, Clear Connect is there for you to use for conversations, discussion, questions, and also remember our Twitter hashtag. And I hope that we'll be getting some stuff out on Twitter from the DLF forum, especially during that session. Okay, again, the recording will be made available from today's webinar, and John and Michelle, I will send you a link to that so that you can reference it if you would like to. So thank you everyone for today's discussion on data collection, discovery, and analysis. A special thank you to our guest speakers, Michelle and John, to our postdoctoral fellows, and to all of you group members. Thank you for your participation in the group activity that you presented today and for joining us for today's webinar. This concludes today's session, and on behalf of CLEAR and DLF, thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.